Hello, this is the Libertarian Party of Saline County News, and let's announce our monthly meetings. So each first Saturday of the month, we have our coffee and discussion at Mocha's South 9th, and that's a very good time for you to be there because we'll discuss whatever you want to, and you can meet some libertarians. Now the state news, we don't have any as far as I know. So let's see, the national news, you know, we've mentioned many times the Libertarian National Committee, the LNC, is the governing body of our national party. And the executive director is the highest paid position. And the previous one, I met him a couple times, and he was a good person, but he was in that position for several years, and now he's moved on. So the new executive director is Dan Fishman. And, you know, as I say, he'll be a paid employee. And our LNC staff in our Virginia headquarters is now about 13. So we're really growing in that respect. And then we have a couple of good news here. Lance Lehman, he won an election recently as a representative for Ward 4 in the Rapid City Council, Iowa. So it's only like a city commission type position, but he won 67% of the vote. He won 548 votes in a runoff election, and he defeated the incumbent, Mrs. Scott. She had had that position since 2012. So that's impressive. You know, he was a new candidate, and he beat the incumbent candidate, and he got 67% of the vote. And then another good news, Bethany Baldiz, she's from Wyoming, and she was a candidate for state representative in Wyoming's 55th district. And she broke the records for the highest percent earned by an LP candidate for state legislature. And she came within 53 votes of unseating the Republican majority leader.
That's impressive.
Yeah, so you can see the Libertarian Party is still small, but in Virginia, in our headquarters, we're getting more and more staff people. And we actually have a paid person now who helps with campaigns. And so this Lehman and Baldi's, those are two good examples of how we're doing very well in our elections. And another thing, you know, most states have affiliates, like in Kansas, our Libertarian Party of Kansas is a state affiliate, and we're recognized by the national party. So 5 LP affiliates have at least 1% of the registered voters in their states. Now that doesn't sound like much. You know, like in Kansas, probably the Republicans probably have 40% of the registered voters. So 1% doesn't sound like much. But here again, we're growing. And less than 10 years ago, only Alaska had 1% of the state's registered voters. So now we have, let's see, 5. So now there are 5 states have 1% or more of the votes. So that's a very good.
Alaska's over 3%. That's
yeah.
Up there.
Okay, now. Maybe you've heard in the news about Mr. Amish. He was a Republican, and he recently changed to independent. So, Joey, would you like to discuss him?
Now, Justin Amash, he's a congressman. He represents Michigan, I believe, is the state he represents.
Yes.
He was elected in 2012. He was actually elected during in 2012, if you remember, the Tea Party movement was big back then. Mm-hmm. Justin Amash is one of a few Republican politicians that are elected that are commonly referred to as Libertarian. Justin Amash and then Thomas Massey is the other one in Congress. And then in Senate, there's Rand Paul, who's the son of famous Libertarian Ron Paul. Both Rand Paul and Amash have been in the news lately, but Amash, he recently commented on the Mueller report, the report that was investigating whether or not Trump had connections with Russia, and they somehow swayed the election in some way, or colluded to buy the election. As most people have seen the news, that pretty much came out that it was false, that didn't happen. But Justin Amash is the only Republican who came out and said that Trump possibly engaged in impeachable offenses. And when he said that, he got a lot of hate from Republicans, including the president. And then on July 4th, he declared his independence from the Republican Party and is now an independent congressman. It's interesting. I've been thinking a lot about this and reading a lot about it, because he's been rumored to run for president in either 2020 or 2024. Yeah. For a couple of years, it's been rumored he was going to run as a Libertarian, and now the big rumor is that he's going to run as an independent. It seems the Libertarian Party National Committee is, for the most part, rejecting the possibility that he's going to be a Libertarian candidate.
What, they don't want him, or?
No. Well, the Libertarian Party posted on their Facebook page yesterday or the day before a picture of all of the current declared candidates for president for Libertarian, and they all said that they stand united against Amash or something like that. They prefer each other to Amash or something like that, which I find interesting, because I think he could garner quite a big vote count. Compared to the current people that are running for president and the Libertarians. But one of the things that a lot of people were concerned about was that if Justin Amash ran as an independent, he would pull a lot of conservative votes away from Trump, therefore giving the election to whoever the Democrat candidate is. But I was listening to a podcast the other day from the website 538.com. And if you don't know what 538 is, they use numbers and algorithms and statistics, and they put it into these systems, and they try to predict the outcomes of various events. They'll do everything from sporting events like games and sports seasons, championships, political elections, all that stuff. And they're usually fairly accurate with their political predictions. And they were talking about how if they were a strategist for the Democrat Party, they would not want Justin Amash to run at all. Because what would actually end up happening is Justin Amash would end up polling votes from moderate Democrats, especially if it's because he is, quote unquote, anti-Trump. And if the Democrats were to nominate a far left candidate, so like Elizabeth Warren or Bernie Sanders or Kamala Harris, there's a lot of those moderate Democrats that don't want the party to go that far left. And so they're actually more likely to vote for a moderate independent than anybody else. So I find it interesting. I wonder if that's part of the Republican strategy, actually, was for him to run as an independent to pull votes away from the Democrats.
I don't know. He certainly sounds to be libertarian. He's a critic of big government, state surveillance, unauthorized war. So those are all good libertarian policies. And he says we've come to a point where Congress just goes along with the president or the other politicians. So you really can't reform the system by the congressional people. And by the way, this is what the Convention of States people have been saying this for years. Maybe you've heard of the Convention of States. They want to have a national, an amendment about these things. So that would be something for them to do. So he's saying the present Congress can't resolve this situation, so it's really up to the outsiders.
And in his Declaration of Independence, he actually quoted George Washington's, what do you call it when they leave office? His
farewell address.
Farewell address, yes, where he warned that partisan politics would be the death of the American government and the political parties. So that's why I kind of think he's not going to run as a libertarian, because he can't say that and then join a political party.
Yeah, it'll be interesting though.
Yeah, another big thing is Rand Paul, actually. If you've heard lately, Congress recently voted on the 9/11 Victims Compensation Fund.
Yeah.
It passed through, I believe it passed through Congress and then went to the Senate. And it came down to Rand Paul's vote, and he actually was the one who was responsible for blocking the funding of this compensation fund. And his reasoning was that he doesn't want to create new funding, because the 9/11 Victims Compensation Fund is a pretty sizable program. It's not just some little spending package.
Billions.
Yeah, it's billions of dollars a year. If you think about it, it's paying for all the people the firefighters that got cancer, the first responders that got cancer, digging through rubble, the families of all the people that died when the towers collapsed. It's a very substantial fund. And Rand Paul's reason for voting against it wasn't that he didn't want it to happen, but that he didn't want to create new funding for it. He wanted to go through and eliminate other spending programs that are less important and use that money to fund the victims fund.
Yeah.
I was doing some research on that victims fund, actually, and it was part of a bill that was passed, an act that was passed 11 days after September 11th, called the Air Transportation Safety and Stabilization Act, which was actually pushed through by Congress while working with the airline lobbies, and the intent was to prevent the 9/11 victims from being able to sue the airlines for any fault that they had or any what's the word I'm looking for, ineptitude, I guess, in the process. So I found it interesting that a lot of people that are really upset about the funding of not getting the funding for this bill, when it's actually a perfect example of the crony capitalist problems in our government, where we have big business working with government to essentially shut out the American people and the consumer.
Yeah, if you're going to sue somebody, you probably ought to sue Saudi Arabia, because most of the people were from there.
Right. Ultimately, yeah, that's who's responsible for 9/11 is the people who did it. But the point that I'm making is the airline companies at the time, before 9/11, were taking a lot less security measures to prevent that kind of thing. There was a lot of loopholes that those terrorists were able to get through in order to make 9/11 happen.
Yeah, well, we'll see what happens. And of course, some congressmen want to have reparations. That's a ridiculous thing. So if you have more money for the 9/11 victims and reparations, and that'll be trillions of dollars.
Are you talking about reparations for slavery?
Yeah.
I heard an interesting thing about a concept for reparations that actually made sense to me. Instead of using tax dollars to pay slavery reparations, private organizations pay reparations. I got the example. I don't know which university it was, but there was a university down south that some students were able to do some research and found out this university almost closed down during the time when slavery was still legal in America. And the university actually sold a bunch of their slaves and used the money to save the building so it wouldn't have to close down. And so they proposed to the school that the descendants of those slaves that were sold be given free tuition as reparations.
Oh, yeah.
And the school actually approved of it. And so like all the descendants of those slaves now, I guess till the end of time, is going to get free tuition to this school. And I was thinking like that's actually a logical way to pay reparations to slavery descendants.
Yeah.
Instead of forcing all white people to pay all black people. Like, for instance, me, I'm white, but my ancestors didn't come to America until the 20s.
Yeah.
So like, my ancestors aren't responsible for American
mine
slavery.
too, yeah. Okay, well, that's all of our Libertarian Party news for tonight. And stay tuned for another LP video. Those are very interesting. They explain a lot of things about our party. So we'll see you next month.
We hear a lot about polarization these days. In fact, last night I was with a group of people who see themselves as political moderates, and most of what they do is wring their hands and worry about the polarization where members of Congress can't just get together and pass good, sensible legislation, like not this 2,000-page health care bill, but like a 1,000-page health care bill, which would be a compromise and bring everybody together. And there is a lot of polarization, and I think it's a problem in some ways for libertarians, and we can talk about that later if you want to. But right now I want to say, in some ways there isn't as much polarization as you might think. In fact, liberals and conservatives have more in common than you might realize. First, both of them believe in government magic, and they want you to believe in it too. They want you to believe that the president can be Superman, Santa Claus, and Mother Teresa all rolled into one, and that he can cure poverty and racism and keep kids off drugs and keep families together and guarantee a house for everybody. And magical thinking is cute among children. But once you become an adult, you're supposed to understand that actions have consequences and that legislative actions often fail or backfire, or have unintended consequences, or disappear into bureaucratic sinkholes or political corruption. Liberals and conservatives both ignore history. Liberals look at the 20th century's grand experiment of socialism versus capitalism, the United States versus the Soviet Union, Western Europe versus Eastern Europe, China versus Hong Kong. They look at all of those natural experiments and they say, you know what we need in the United States? More socialism. We should have more socialism in our healthcare system, more socialism in our energy system, more socialism in our educational system. That's their understanding of what they draw from history. Conservatives, meanwhile, think that the government can just restore the happy world of the 1950s, ignoring the most basic lesson of history, which is that things change. Nothing remains the same. Both liberals and conservatives respond to special interests. Go back to the Bush administration. They had an energy bill that was designed by the energy companies, a steel tariff on imports for the steel industry, a Medicare drug entitlement to shift costs from big business to the taxpayers, the proposed federal marriage amendment for religious rights supporters. And the voters got fed up and they throw them out. And then we got the Obama administration, which comes in and offers money, money, money for every group that supported him. Special rules to help the unions and the trial lawyers, a cap-and-trade bill that in fact is backed by Conoco, Shell, and BP, or technically it was never endorsed by BP. The moment came when the administration said, we'd actually prefer that BP not endorse our energy bill. But they were prepared to, and they have endorsed things like that in the past. So, in fact, they did give the Obama administration what it wanted. They agreed not to publicly endorse the Obama administration's energy bill. And he came up with a health care plan that was boosted by the AMA and Big Pharma. So both of them responding to special interests. Both liberals and conservatives involved the nation in unnecessary wars. After the end of the Cold War, you'd have thought there might be a chance, with the Soviet Union defeated, for an era of peace. But conservatives decided at that point that the United States should send troops anywhere in the world that our vital interests are threatened, and it turned out they had a very liberal definition of what our vital interests were. Liberals take a different tack. They like to send American troops anywhere our vital interests are not threatened, because that's more selfless and altruistic. And it turns out there are even more places in the world that our vital interests are not threatened, so we get to go off and start wars in Bosnia, Somalia, Liberia. Meanwhile, when the liberals take over from the conservatives, they don't end the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. They keep them going. Both liberals and conservatives think that your life belongs to the state. John McCain, during his campaign, actually throughout his political career, has said things like, Americans need to serve a national purpose that is greater than our individual interests. Meanwhile, Obama, during his campaign, told college students, our individual salvation depends on collective salvation. They don't think that your life counts. They don't think you have a right to liberty or to the pursuit of happiness. They don't think you have a right to live your life as you choose. They think it belongs to the state. And the number one way liberals and conservatives are alike, both think they can run your life better than you can. I like to call liberals and conservatives the Hillarys and the Huckabees. Hillary Clinton and Mike Huckabee are two classic examples of two strains of big government thinking in a country that is otherwise pretty committed to small government. Hillary is the quintessential nanny state liberal who is determined to have the government take care of adult Americans the way parents take care of children. Huckabee wants the government to stamp out sin and make us all do God's will as he sees it. So the Huckabees want to censor cable television because they don't think you can be trusted to decide what your family should watch. They support bans on drugs, pornography, gambling, and violent video games because you're just not smart enough to handle temptations like that. They want prayer in the schools and sound science out. They want to subsidize heterosexual marriage and ban gay marriage. They want government to take the place of God and stamp out sin on earth. Former Senator Rick Santorum is out on the campaign trail these days, believe it or not. He wasn't qualified to be a senator from Pennsylvania, but now he thinks he can run for president. And he's out on the campaign trail talking about Goldwater, Reagan, and the Tea Party. But he is, in fact, a classic Huckabee who, in his book and in interviews on NPR and other places, has complained about, quote, this whole idea of personal autonomy, this idea that people should be left alone. He doesn't like the idea that people should be left alone. Meanwhile, the Hillarys want to raise your taxes because they think they can spend your money more wisely than you can. They don't believe in school choice because you don't know how to choose a school for your children. They think they can handle your retirement savings and health care better than you can. And they think, as Hillary Clinton herself has advocated, that the government should produce video lectures on how to burp a baby and how to brush your teeth and have them, quote, running continuously in doctors' offices, clinics, hospitals, motor vehicle offices, or any other place where people gather and have to wait. You have to go to a government office, you're forced to wait, and then they want to put this telescreen up there and run videos on how to burp a baby and how to brush your teeth. The Huckabees want to be your daddy, telling you what to do and what not to do. The Hillarys want to be your mama, feeding you, tucking you in, and setting your curfew. But the proper role for government in a free society is to treat adults as adults, responsible for making their own decisions and taking the consequences. And the good news is that mostly we do that, despite the Hillarys and the Huckabees. The United States is a free country thanks to the founders and the Constitution they gave us, and to the cantankerous, individualist, free enterprising, revolutionary, don't tread on me people who populate it. Historians and political scientists have long noted that America is fundamentally shaped by libertarian values and attitudes. In the book, It Didn't Happen Here, Why Socialism Failed in the United States, the great political scientist Seymour Martin Lipset and his co-author Gary Marks write, quote, the American ideology stemming from the revolution can be subsumed in 5 words: anti-statism, laissez-faire, individualism, populism, and egalitarianism. Another great political scientist, two distinguished political scientists, Herbert McCloskey and John Zauler, made a similar point in 1984. The American ethos is a combination of capitalism and democracy, both of which serve to limit and divide power. And some people aren't happy about this libertarian ethos of America. 2 Ivy League professors, one of whom is now the regulatory czar of the Obama administration, lamented in a book a few years ago that libertarian ideas, quote, are astonishingly widespread in American culture. They'd spent a whole book explaining why liberty is a stupid idea, and in the last chapter they had to concede, and yet these ideas are astonishingly widespread in American culture. In America, even our revolutions are often libertarian, and this is different from the rest of the world. Most of the revolutions in the world seem to bring in bigger and worse government. In America, though, in the 1960s, we had a cultural revolution that extended the promises of the Declaration of Independence to new groups and new issues such as equal rights for women, blacks, and gays, anti-war and free speech protests, and the do-your-own-thing ethos of the so-called counterculture, which may in fact have had more in common with the individualist American culture than was recognized at the time. They called it a counterculture, but in a way it was a revolution within the form. It was a revolution to make America more like America. And then in the 1980s, we had a Reagan revolution that involved tax cuts, deregulation, and an appreciation for entrepreneurship. And few political analysts have come to terms with the fact that the 60s and the 80s both happened in the same generation. Many of the same people were involved in the anti-war movement or the counterculture of the 1960s, the personal liberation and self-help movements of the 1970s, and the entrepreneurial upsurge of the 1980s. And all those trends build on the individualism of the American ethos and point toward an increase in choice and self-reliance. But despite that heritage of freedom, we've always got the Hillarys and the Huckabees and the other people who think they could run our lives better than we can. The Huckabees on the right continue to resist the cultural changes of the 1960s. The Hillarys on the left continue to resist the economic changes of the 1980s.